between having after I've been doing development for a little while, I had this great idea for a product. And so I started my own company and started being a startup, and then learned the difference between having a great idea and being able to sell a great idea. And so that started me getting into sort of ideas of lean startup and going into the product side of business. And so I've kind of like found my way all the way around in various different agile spaces. And I just loved every part that I've been in. So I enjoy putting it all together and weaving it all together. And so a lot of what I've been doing is helping leadership and executives, and especially product managers, to be able to go through some of the same learning experiences that I had gotten as a startup, and with my company, of really understanding, are we working on the right things? I think some of these techniques, some of these ideas could not have come from a lot of other places than like a startup environment, because in a startup environment, you are right there on the edge. And so if you don't make the sale, if you don't get to the next step of what you're doing, like you may not have a company anymore. And so making sure that you're working on the right things, making sure everybody's working together towards the same direction, make sure nobody is working against each other. These are super critical inside of a startup, because it means whether or not they live or die. But it also turns out, as I'm sure many of you know, that you need to do those things in large enterprise organizations as well. So we transfer a bunch of that knowledge over. So the technique I'm going to show you today is something that I start working together with folks to help them to kind of get aligned, to try to get everybody pointed in that same direction, to understand why we're here, what we're doing. And a lot of it comes from some of the lean startup background and some of the philosophies that go into that. So I'll talk about that a little bit in a couple of different places. This is also based on design thinking ideas and principles, and some concepts that come from design thinking and usability. Specifically, you'll notice that there's some use of the design thinking double diamond, and so we'll use some of those things together. But I don't want to talk too much. I'd much rather do things. So I'm putting in a link to a Miro board. I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share here. So let me do a quick check. Is everybody able to see the board here?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So as you come into this board, as you interact with this board, if you've never used these things before, I'm going to give you a quick, sort of introduction to it and how to sort of navigate around. If you've got a trackpad like I do, you can use 2 fingers and you can scroll around the screen with 2 fingers. You can also use the arrow up here. If you click on the arrow in the top left-hand side, then you can grab a screen. You can start moving things around and do some navigation of stuff. There's also zoom controls if you're trying to move in and out or around on different things. You can also pinch to zoom in and out on things. And then, let's see, I think if you click on me, you can do follow as well. So you can see my screen and go where I am. But if you get lost, just come back to the Zoom, watch the Zoom. I'll be showing everything that's here. You're mostly going to be over here in the section using some of these things here for sticky notes. I created some already. You can create duplicates if you want. You can right click on sticky notes and you can choose duplicate from the pop-up menu. Your menu is going to be a little bit different than mine. So those are kind of the basics in general of using the Miro platform. Again, if you don't have the ability to use that, or that's not working for you as well, you can also use the chat. So we've got a bunch of people here that can help collect ideas, and then they can call that out for you. And so I mentioned that, hey, we got some stuff in the chat. Somebody suggested this. We can add that in to the board as well. All right, so I think that covers logistics and the pieces of that. So if you have any questions, go ahead and post them in chats about how to use Miro or how to get around. Somebody will be able to help you to be able to get acclimated there. So let's jump into the idea. So this is really good in working about a process of doing a prioritization. So the name for this technique is called the PEP Talk. And so you may have seen that in there. It's goal-based leadership using the PEP Talk. PEP stands for Prioritize Epic Problems. I'll get back to the why in a little bit and those pieces of it, but that's where the origins of the name are. And it's based on this idea of a design thinking kind of approach to our business problems. And one of the things that's part of design thinking that's a big sort of part of that is that you're looking at your problem separate from your solutions. And that's not something that every organization does. A lot of times I walk into organizations and we're doing some consulting and helping them to work out certain things. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that they're focused on solutions. They've got these ideas for solutions. They've got a great prioritized list of solutions. But when you ask them which customer problem does that solution solve, they may not know. They're just like, this is my list. This is the things I have to build. And then we know that the feedback loops help with this, but there's also a design process that can help with this idea of getting us together, making sure we're working on the right thing. And it's the first step of here is separating out into two main steps. So the first step is to look and focus on the problem. And the second step is then to focus on the solution. And within each step, there's two sub-steps inside of that. The first one is about divergence. So this idea of problem divergence. So we're going to think about a bunch of different ideas. So this is going to be like your brainstorming kind of concepts. The same kind of concept, same idea, came from the same places. And the idea is to get a lot of ideas out there and just throw those ideas onto the page and then start working backwards from that. And then we're going to go through and we're going to pick out of those major problems that we could solve, what's the next most important problem that we should tackle? And then we narrow it down into one important problem. And then we go on to solutions and say, okay, how could we solve this? So that's sort of the core idea behind that. But let's do some simulation of this. So you're going to see up here that there is a prompt question up here. And the prompt question is, what's wrong with management today? Now, this doesn't have to be, actually, I don't want it to be about specific people that work at your company. Instead, let's use the topic and just talk about the process. So what is the problem with management process today? Or what are some of the problems that we have with the governance process inside of organizations? So go ahead and click on some of these stickies over here, some of the pink stickies in this first area. And we're just going to take about 5 minutes. And I want you to add in some different problems that you are encountering and the different things that you see. I also threw in here that federal government examples are welcome. So that I find that there's a lot of mirroring between what we're experiencing, especially in the US, when it comes to our government and the way things are going up there. And then there's also, and there's a lot of that sort of repeat when we come down into some of the organizations. All right, great. So we got a couple things coming in here. I see somebody added a comment. So if you double click in the sticky note, it gives you a cursor and you can start to you can put that text directly into the sticky note. That's going to make it a little bit easier for us to interact with. All right, so while you do that, I'm going to talk about these things over to the right. So these are nice techniques that I use in parallel with this or as part of the instructions for this. So the first one is if you want to conduct this exercise, you want to do this together with your teams. I like to observe what we call the Ratatouille Principle. And it's called the Ratatouille Principle because it's based off of Pixar's movie called Ratatouille. And I won't give you any details. I don't want to ruin for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. But basically in that, at the end of that movie, there's this critic and his name is Ego. And he gives this great quote that's actually a quote that they use inside of Pixar, which is that not every, here he says artist, but we're going to use the idea. So not every idea is a great idea, but a great idea can come from anywhere. So we need to have a process that is equal, complete, open, and fair so that everybody gets a chance to put stuff in because we never know where the great ideas are going to come from. And so that's the important first step of that. That's important process is that Ratatouille Principle. Now, another way that you can describe this, and actually comes again from Pixar, Ed Catmull, who's the CEO of Pixar, says that his phrase is, ideas are like ugly ducklings. So they need space and support to grow into swans. Dang, smart devices. Sorry, I don't know if anybody could hear that. All right, so, all right, and we get back to Ed Catmull, where you're still putting some stuff in there. Thank you for filling out the sticky notes here. So Ed Catmull tells these stories about the early days of working with like all of our favorite movies. So like Toy Story. He said the first version of Toy Story, like Woody was, he uses a different word for it, but he was basically a pain in the butt. And he said that the way it was originally written, and they showed it to some early audiences and they tried to test it out. Like people just hated Woody. They're like, why should this be a buddy movie? Why would anybody want to be friends with Woody? And they had to go back and work on it and workshop it. And he told another story about, if you know the story or if you know the movie Inside Out, and it's I think it's Pete Docter, and he does this movie about what happens in your brain. It's kind of like a biology of your brain, but translated into animated characters to sort of show this stuff off. And so Catmull tells a story about how like those early versions of things, those early versions of ideas were just not good at all. They actually shelved Inside Out for about 10 years. The idea actually came, I think it was about the same time as Monsters, Inc., or maybe actually before it. And it just wasn't working, couldn't figure it out. So they shelved it for a while. They went out and they made Monsters, Inc. They made a couple other movies, and then they came back to it. And Pete Docter was like, oh, I figured out how to do, I think this is how to do this movie. And then so they brought it back. So we always need to give space for ideas, and we need to be very careful up front that we're not limiting what we're doing, that we're not judging it too quickly. So important step when you're doing the first step of this, the brainstorming, is we want to just put the ideas on the screen. We want to collect those things. We're not going to evaluate them or judge them in any way. The only thing I'm going to ask you to do is to do some clarifying questions. So if we need clarifying questions on any of the points that are up here, we're going to go ahead and collect that. So we've got some time here, so I'm giving some space for people to put the problems in. And while you're at it, go ahead and look at some of the other problems that are listed up here as well. And I'll open up the floor if you want to type into the chat. Are there any questions? So if you look through the cards and you're sort of asking this, I'm going to do this as I go along as well. So problems with management today. Thank you. So they don't know Pete. Okay. You know, I haven't gotten the cloning working down yet. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. They delegate too much. Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. They often expect quick fixes. Yep. They have an idea. They have some delivery they want to do. And they're like, okay, when can you have it? Everything is a priority. That's another problem that we can have. They know Agile, but they don't understand Agile. Yeah. They often put the teams through an Agile training, but they don't necessarily go to Agile training themselves, or they're not living it on a day-to-day basis, so they may not really understand what makes for a good Agile implementation. Let me see this one. So we have Agile Waterfall. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and type that in here. Agile Waterfall. Could whoever posted this one maybe add in a little bit more detail? So just a little more details on what you were thinking of for Agile Waterfall, because this could mean a lot of different things. I totally agree with you. This is a big problem. But what specifically were you thinking about the impact? What problem does an Agile Waterfall approach take? Oh, there we go again. So if you want to type it into chat, you can do that, or you can leave a reply onto one of these messages, and I will go ahead and transfer that over to the sticky note. Okay, another one here, silo. Left hand does stuff and hands off to the right hand, and they don't necessarily communicate between people. Okay, very good. That makes sense to me. Too much reporting overhead. Okay, we got to put it together, but then we have to talk about what we're putting together, and we have to collect some data on what we're putting together, and all that stuff has to be put together at the same time as we're actually building it. And so that has some impacts on things. Working in silos, I'm going to assume this goes together, same thing. So actually, I'm going to do a little bit of clustering here of those things. Let's see. Control and no trust. Okay. Yep. Hard to prioritize everything is number one. Yep. That's another one. It's very similar to this one. So I'll go ahead and put this down here. And then low trust. And so I'll go ahead and group that one up here with this one. All right. I didn't see any. Let me check the chat, see what we've got for some messages here. All right. Waterfall could be micromanaging. Okay. All right. So we'll sort of assume that that is about micromanagement, which is kind of the opposite, I think, of the delegating too much. So I love that we've got these opposites, because the opposites often come into play. And so we can work on that. All right, but you can see what I'm doing right here at this stage is I am not going through and giving any evaluation on that. I'm not saying anything more than I don't understand this and I need more information, or I do understand this. We'll get into the discussions of that in the next phase. Right now, we're just brainstorming. And one of the first rules of brainstorming is you just get the ideas out. We don't edit ourselves, because once we get into this process of editing ourselves, then we start to slow everything down and we start to block the creative juices. Creative juices work really well in a sense when you can keep putting these ideas out, when you can flow with it, when you can keep delivering these things. This is something that artists do a lot, and so I think that's why I got baked into the design thinking process. But it all comes into play and has some good outcomes. All right, there's one more down here. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. Knowledge management. Since heavy reliance on contractors. Contractors are mobile due to the nature of contracts. Ooh, that's a good one. I put that, sorry, I just offered an evaluation there. They're all great. They're all good ones. But this one is, yeah, I get this one and this idea. I've seen this before, that there's this heavy reliance on contractors. And what I've seen is that contractors then move on to another space when they're done with that, and they're not available when we need to come back and look at something. And so now we've lost that knowledge, and there hasn't been that knowledge transfer to the new set of people who are then responsible for doing that management stuff. All right, so I didn't look at the clock, but that should be right about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more. So let's go ahead and take what we've got, because we got a fantastic list here. And now let's move on to the next space. So I'm going to walk you through the instructions for the next space. And then we're going to get into the process, and we're actually going to model this out. So instruction number one is that we go through in a round. And so we're going to do it in Zoom using raised hands. So if you have an idea that you want to propose, you can raise your hand. Then people here can help to look through that list of participants. They can see the raised hands, and they're going to invite you in to talk, make you an ability to talk. You could also type your response into the chat if you want to do that. So what I'm looking for is that somebody is going to propose an idea. And when you make that proposal, what you get to do is you get to pick a problem from the pool, from this list over here to the left. And then you're going to add it to the list over here on the right in a particular order. So the first time we do it, it's going to go into slot number one. The second time we do it, you're going to grab one from over here, and we're going to say, I think this is problem number two. So, the first round, I'm going to say, what is, and this is my first prompt. So start thinking about this. You can start raising your hands. You can start typing it into the chat box. My first prompt is, out of these problems that we've listed, which one is the most important problem? Which one is causing the most problems? Which is the most important thing for us to solve and to have some kind of solution around? And so whoever raises their hand, whoever gets called on, whoever we go with first, and for folks that are the panelists, and if you can help me identify who is the first person with their hand up, so that we can use that item that they listed. So we're going to take that problem, we're going to move it over to the first hand slot, and that will be your round. And so I'd like to hear from you as far as why you think that is the most important thing. Then we're going to move on, and we're going to do the next couple steps after this. So now, the second time we go through this, somebody's going to either come over here and grab a new one and move it in. And they could say, I think this is more important than the one that the last person posted. And so we can put that into its spot as number one and move the other one down to number two. Or they can say, I think it's less important. So I'm going to put this into slot number two behind slot number one. And then we're going to continue through the steps 2, 3, and 4 for that one. Now, a good way to sort of rule of thumb for this is to ask yourself, if you ever got stuck in a spot where you couldn't solve problem number one and problem number two at the same time, and you had to make a choice, Is it better to solve problem number one and leave problem number two alone? If so, you're in the right order. If it's better for you to solve problem number two and then problem number one is, if you don't get to that one, it's not such a big deal, or it's a big deal, but not as big of a deal as the one below it, then you need to swap it. And so that's what we're saying when we say, I want to swap this. We're saying, if we couldn't do both of these, I think this one's more important. The third thing you can do is propose removing something. So you could go up there and say, hey, since we just finished doing X, or we rolled out this new feature, or based on the conversations that we were just having, I don't think we need this one anymore, and I think we should take it off the list. So that's our third option. Now, if you're doing this with a group of people that's on a regular team, and you can do this in rounds. You go through each person in the team, and you have them go through and make a choice and a contribution. Now, if you do that, the fourth option here is that anybody can pass. They can say, I don't want to propose anything right now. I'm not feeling strongly about one way or another. So those are the four ways to sort of take a turn as the first step. Then what we're going to do is we're going to do a quick temperature check. That's all we're going to do. We're just going to do a yes, no, up, down. And we're going to say, we're just going to collect from folks. We're going to do this here using voting inside the Miro app. So I'll show you how to do that when we get here. And this is really just to see if we're on the same page. Because if we're on the same page and everybody's like, yep, I think that's the most important thing, or yeah, I think that is more important than number two, and everybody's in agreement, stop. Why spend all the extra time trying to debate back and forth and having a conversation about it? You're just preaching to the choir at that point, to use that phrase. So we're going to do that quick temperature check, and we're going to see, does anybody have an objection? Does anybody say no? If so, those are the people we want to hear from first. And so we're going to ask you to unmute. We're going to ask you to give your reasoning why, because we do want these to be reasoned objections. So we want to hear, why do you think that this is the wrong order? Or why do you think this is in the wrong place? We're going to put a time box on it so that we can sort of keep the conversations going. So if anybody has an argument or a counter argument, as we discuss this back and forth, I'm just going to ask you to keep it within a time box and keep it within 1 minute. And then it's important to put a time box on each evaluation process, because if you do a big open-ended conversation, time can really start to get away from you. And so I have found that putting a time box on, whether it's 10 minutes each or 5 minutes each, whatever you think it is, we're going to do 5 minutes today, just for the sake of our discussions and the amount of time that we have together. So that's going to just give us a chance to sort of be able to hear from multiple different voices and talk things through. And then at the end of that, we're going to do one more vote, and we're going to do and we're going to take the majority vote at that point. And so whichever one wins, whichever one gets the most votes, and that's going to go to the top of the list. That's going to be the higher one, and the other one's going to be the lower one. All right, so variety of different things here. So let's practice this. Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to check the chat, or if somebody already knows, what is somebody's contribution? What do you think is the biggest problem? I have all those problems here on the left-hand side. What is the biggest problem when it comes to management today? You can raise your hand. You can type it in chat. And I will wait. I'm a big person about volunteers. I don't volunteer anybody else. I wait for people to volunteer themselves. So anybody got an idea? Anybody got a question? Panelists, you can join in as well. So if you want to pick one of these things and get us started.
We have a response from Jennifer. It's priorities.
Yeah. Priorities. All right. So is this essentially this idea of hard to prioritize everything? Everything is number one? All right, so I'm going to drag that over here to item number 1. All right, thank you for that. Do you want to give a little bit of a justification or reasoning behind that? You can type it into chat, or we can turn on the microphone for you if it's easier for you just to say it. But I'd love to hear some details about why you think that is the most important problem that we're tackling.
I think because when there's so many, there's no focus factor, or there's an overwhelming feeling of all this work that needs to be done. So you lose that focus factor.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yep. Losing focus. Great. Thank you. All right. So first round goes really fast, so we don't have to do any other steps. So second round, somebody pick another one that you think should go over here. And drag this one over and cluster it just so that we're all in the same spot. So what's another problem over here that you think is, and then you can propose that this becomes problem number one. You may look at this and say, actually, I think this is more of a problem than prioritizing, like not having a good priority order. Or you can say that, nope, I think this is number two. I think this is the one that comes in after that. All right.
See a response from
Yeah, I see Prashamsa.
Ashima. Yeah.
Prashamsa, you can talk if you want to share more.
I see.
All right.
Sorry.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Micromanaging, especially because I think when you are saying you are agile, you think you're doing agile, but at the end of the day, you're micromanaging. So that I think is a problem because it's in denial. And it's hard to point out. Acceptance is easier. It gets easier to coach, to mentor, to guide. But if you're in denial, it gets a little more difficult to coach that kind of mindset.
All right, I'm with you on that. I think there should be like a micromanaging anonymous where managers can go and learn how to not micromanage.
Yeah.
All right. So what is your
easy?
what is your proposal here as far as? Or should we do this? Is that number two, or is that a bigger problem than lack of priorities?
Well, lack of priority can be handled by a little bit of more coaching and mentoring and guiding and seeing where, where you're lacking and what's needed, and probably lack of understanding of the domain knowledge or understanding what your priorities are. That is easier, but I think micromanaging is a higher priority because you're in denial and you don't want to accept that you're micromanaging. You say you trust somebody, but you don't. So.
All right, so I'm going to do this right now, just to note that the proposal here is to move micromanaging up first and moving lack of prioritization down later. So now we need to do a little voting. Now I only see 3 of you on the board right now, so we'll probably have to do this inside of the chat. Is this, do we have reactions? No, I don't see reactions. So let's do just typing into chat. So what I want you to type into chat is, which one do you think is more important, micromanaging or prioritization? So the proposal is micromanaging. So if everybody says micromanaging, then I'll just go ahead and make the change. But if I do get some folks who say that prioritization is a bigger problem than micromanaging, then we'll launch into a discussion about that.
Should we number them? Micromanaging is 1 and prioritization is 2. So you can put in the chat 1 or 2.
All right, let's do that.
Can we do 1 and 2?
So 1 is micromanaging, 2 is prioritization. What are
You can't do 1 and 2, only one number.
So here itself, you cannot.
Right, you can't vote for both,
priorities.
only one. All right, we do have a lot of 1s. We have a couple 2s. All right, so for our temperature check, there are some objections, some reasoned objections. And so I'm going to go back through and ask some of the folks who voted. So Jennifer or Michael, would you like to make a case for why you think prioritization is a larger problem than micromanaging?
I see a response from Inam. They do
Yeah, I see that.
respect agile rules. Always push additional objective in sprints.
All right. So you're saying the prioritization is a bigger problem because they're always pushing the additional objectives into the sprint. I guess because that adds to the overburdening. So it adds more.
Yes, adding more work, but don't agree to stretch the sprint timeline. They want to stick to 2-week sprint, but they don't respect the point system allocated at the beginning of the sprint.
Okay. So they're adding more work. They're getting people distracted, and they're sort of breaking the sprints and making life harder. So what you're saying is that is making life harder on teams than micromanaging.
I believe micromanaging is the first I would say, but this is also second. I would go second or third but this is the most common thing where stretching the goals of the sprint.
All right. And thank you. You give me an option to be able to do something, to mention something that has to come up in the course of this process. So one of the things that I do as part of this prioritization process is, if it's like, I'm going to say it this way, and I hope you don't, it doesn't come across wrong. I would prefer that you not give an answer for somebody else. So if your feeling is that micromanaging is a bigger problem, don't give an answer for why prioritization is a bigger problem, even if you're trying to help somebody else. I'd rather hear from the people who are doing the objection and hear why they think that prioritization is the bigger problem. Because sometimes when it's not our thoughts, but we're trying to think for or talk for other people, we either might be silencing those voices and they don't have an opportunity to speak up. So that could be a thing about equality. This happens a lot in places that don't have good diversity practices, is often people will speak up for the team. And they're like, oh, they're not going to speak. And what they're doing is they're just training those team members to say, oh, this person is going to speak for me and I don't need to speak for myself. So that's the reason why I make that choice and why I build that into the rules. But thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be able to talk about that rule. All right, so it sounds like you said, Anam, that you like micromanaging first, prioritization second. And Jennifer, you're saying you can manage up, but if you don't know the priority, you don't know the focus. Gotcha. So you're saying we've got strategies for being able to do the upward management stuff. But if you're constantly being pulled back and forth between a bunch of different things, you don't know what to focus on, it wastes a lot of time. That costs us more in the long run than micromanaging does. That would be my interpretation of what you just said. Do you want to say anything in that way? All right. Yes, she said it with thumbs up. All right. Anybody else want to say anything? So we've got a discussion going on here. So I'm going to do a quick thing. So we're going to select 2 objects. Well, actually, sorry, there's not a lot of people in Miro, so we're going to leave, I'm going to skip that step. We're going to leave it inside of the chat. So now we're going to take our sort of official vote before we move on to the next item. So we're going to do the same thing again. Let's use letters. So let's use M and P. So M for micromanaging and P for prioritization. Which do you think is a bigger problem? What is the higher problem, bigger problem? That if we solve prioritization, but we still had micromanagers, is that a better place to be? If so, put a P. But if we solved micromanaging, they weren't micromanaging everything, but we still had everything was the same priority, then you're saying that solving micromanaging is a better outcome, and that's the more important thing. In that case, put an M. So go ahead and put that into the chat. Do you vote for an M or a P? Is it more important to solve micromanaging or more important to solve prioritization? All right, so far we're tied, 1-1. All right, we got 3-1.
Yep. We have 20 people on the call. I just see 4 responses.
All right, yeah, do we have any more votes here? All right, so I'm gonna make the call. And I'm gonna move these down to number 2, and I'll put micromanaging in as number 1. All right, so now we're up to step 2, or the next step here. So anybody who's got a proposal, your options are, you can propose, you may say, I have a new argument, I wanna reorder those things. I'm gonna guess probably we're not gonna do that for right now at this stage, but you could say, grab another one over here and say, I think this one should go in slot number 1 or 2 or 3, wherever you think it should go in the list. Who's got an idea? There's also a problem here of delegating too much, lack of understanding about Agile, expecting quick fixes.
I think there's so much of reporting and process that management does it. That is also a lot of overhead, added overhead.
Which one?
Too much reporting overhead.
Okay.
Yeah, like, a lot of process, just for the sake of, doing the process, there's so much of overhead that's added, not seeing the value. So that is also one of the key management failures that I see.
All right. Okay. Where do you want to put this in a list? Do you want to put this in as number 3, or do you want to put it between micromanaging and prioritization, or do you want to put it at the top?
Let's see. I definitely, maybe I would go with 3.
3? All right. So let's take a quick temperature check on that. So let's say if you like this at position number 3, so too much reporting overhead, go ahead and just type a 3 into that spot. If not, and we're just going to do the adjacent one next to it, which is the idea of prioritization. So if we say that, because we don't need to worry about micromanaging, because if we're saying that we're moving it above prioritization, then we're saying that this is too far down. It's always better to go one step at a time and not try to do multiple steps. So I'm just asking you to go between number 3 and number 2. So if you think too much reporting is our 3rd biggest problem, type a 3 into the chat. If you think too much reporting actually is higher than prioritization, is a bigger problem than prioritization, that if we could just get rid of the report and we could worry about the prioritization later, put a number 2 in the chat. So which position do you think this should be? Should this be number 3 or should this be number 2? Thank you, Ankit. Thank you, Jennifer. And actually,
We have a consensus here.
Yeah, we have consensus so far, so we don't have to go much further on this one. All right. Looks like we got a prioritization there. All right, so I'm looking at the clock, and you've got the feel for how this works. Now, I'm going to talk through a couple other pieces on sort of this thing and how it works, but what you can do next, what are the following stages you can do with this, how you can take it into the next level. So we start to get this list of prioritized problems. Now, you can tackle the first problem first. That's one way that you could do this. So you could then post this up and say, all right, most important thing we've decided to solve now is micromanaging. So we're going to take micromanaging, and now I want you to brainstorm a bunch of solutions. So how could we solve for micromanaging? What are some different techniques that we could use? And we could start to populate out these things here. Another way you can do this is you can look at this and say, it's better if we could solve multiple problems at once. So let's just do some open brainstorming. So what are the things that, maybe the things we're already working on, things we already have prioritized in our backlog, or maybe it's some new ideas that we have, but look at that and compare it against this problem list. You know, all of those practices that we could introduce with our management teams, with our product owners to solve this, you know, in this category here. Is there anything here that would take care of micromanaging that would also help to give us a priority and that would cut down on the reporting overhead? I mean, I'll toss out one, for example, that's actually what I use this technique for. So the PEP Talk helps me to get out of micromanaging because it helps me to get the managers thinking about the problems to be solved instead of telling them what the solutions are to solve them. And at the same time, it's giving us a priority order. So we can tie our different features and the different things that we want to implement to the priority thing, and we get an inherited prioritization. So we can say that if this third solution over here, for example, solves micromanaging and the fourth one solves prioritization, then the one that solves the micromanaging is our most important thing. Again, we're doing brainstorming here. So we're letting anybody come up with ideas. We're using the same ideas as the Ratatouille Principle, and we're not doing any editing on what goes into this page. It's just a place for open brainstorming in step 3 of this process. So that helps to encourage micromanaging. So if you can solve more than one problem at a time, that's always going to be the better solution. And this works with product features as well. So I've had some examples for this and some abilities, you know, some ways to do this. So all of those things are the same thing. It's very similar to the first set of instructions where you just ask clarifying questions. So people post up their abilities to solve this. I've also taken and had people take their entire backlog or their backlog of features or epics, and if you're using Jira, and put them on the blue sticky notes here and do a comparison and say, all right, going through each of these sticky notes, which problem does it solve? And that usually pops up and allows us to see that we're working on a bunch of things. We may have 1 or 2 different things inside of our backlog, if you're lucky. Usually it's more than 1 or 2 things. That's not actually solving any customer problem. So if what we're doing, if our prompt over here on the left-hand side is what are our biggest customer problems? You know, what are the things that our customers need to solve? And then we can point out and say, hey, this thing over on the right doesn't solve a customer problem. That helps to give us these priorities. Plus, since we've had this discussion about what order we're going in, then as we're looking at those solutions, we can naturally start to give a priority order for it. Now, the second step of this is that if you know anything about WSJF, which stands for weighted shortest job first, we get into this idea of economic prioritization, which is to say that something may be really important, but it may be also really difficult to build. And so if we need to take into account the size of something and how long it's going to take for that thing to be built. So it may solve the idea, our number one problem over there on the left-hand side. And so we may be, have a great problem, but it would take us 6 months to get it done. Whereas we could solve problem number 2 of prioritization, and we can get that done in 2 weeks. It's actually better for us to tackle the thing that is the shorter thing, even though it's a slightly less priority, but get it done, get it tackled, and now we've got this prioritization thing. So maybe just like teaching this technique is going to give us some better prioritization, and that's good enough, or that's like an MVP version of solving that problem. So we're going to say that this, teaching this technique is going to be one of our solutions that we're going to do. It's going to be really quick, so we're going to give it a really low size, but it's tied to our most important thing here. And so if you want to do full calculation, so one of the things we started doing is you can estimate job size in Fibonacci weeks, because as we get higher in our estimations, we get less precise. So if you're not familiar with Fibonacci, each of the sequence numbers adds up to the number after it. So 1 + 2 = 3, and 2 + 3 = 5, and 3 + 5 = 8. So that's how that goes. And so you say, I can get this done in 1 week. I can get this done in 2 weeks. I can get this done in 3 weeks. I can get this done in 5 weeks. So basically what we're looking at is like, I can get this done in a week, or I can get this done in a sprint, or I can get this done in about a month, or I can get this done in about 2 months or a PI, or I can get this thing done in a quarter, or this is going to take me half of the year. And so it allows you to give some sort of, rough sizings on stuff. And then what we used to do for value is we come over here and say, however many we have. We got, let's say we have a list of 12 things. Then we give a score of 12 to the most important thing, and 11 to the one after it, and then 10, 9, 8 down. And then we take our solution. So we like teaching this PEP Talk to people. That solves 2 problems. So we're going to take number 12 and number 11, we're going to add it together, and we're going to say that that is a 23. And so we're going to say 23, this thing solves 2 problems here. So we're going to give it a score of a 23 as a numerator, divided by, we think we can do it in 1 week. So we're going to divide it by 1. And so our WSJF score for that is going to be a 23. And so this is why I call it sort of a rapid WSJF. We're not trying to get into too much detail, but we're letting our business value be driven by customer problems, be driven by problems that we're trying to solve, instead of being driven by, I want this feature, or I think this feature is important. So we keep it focused on those customers, business value tied there, and then we divide it by our size so that we have that balance between things. So those are the things that you can do afterwards. That's how you can tie all these pieces in together. And what you end up with is a nice prioritized list of features that you can build into your applications, and you can tie it back. So you can always tie back and say, the reason that we're doing X is because of Y over here in our problem list. All right, so last things I'll sort of say here as a wrap up, as I'll walk through a couple things here. Let me zoom out a little bit so that we can see this a little bit better. So some things that this technique does. So now that you've seen it in action, I like to do these things at the end so you can kind of see where the thinking comes from. As you may have noticed in there, what this does is promotes win-win thinking. So if you haven't heard about this process, oftentimes it's like we're comparing one thing against another. And so the idea is that if we choose, feature A, then feature B has to wait. And so feature A feature B has lost to feature A. But what this does instead is it ranks these priorities, it puts them in order, and then it encourages the teams to come up with solutions that solve multiple problems at a time. If we can take care of a couple things at a time, we're now thinking win-win. How could we solve problem A and solve problem B at the same time? As long as we don't take too long to do it. And so we don't have to make these calls and say, one thing is more important than the other. It also helps with this idea of yes and thinking. If you ever run into this, it's an improv thing. It's been brought over and adopted by a lot of Scrum Masters. The improv thing is when you are improvising a scene. So if you've ever seen, like they do this sometimes on Saturday Night Live, although those things are a little bit more scripted. If you do any of the comedy troupes, let's set one out of Chicago. We've got a lot of Saturday Night Live and a bunch of actors that came out of there, and I'm blanking on it right now. But they do entirely improvised plays. And one of the things that you learn when you're doing that process is this idea of yes and. Whatever somebody says, you say yes, and then you add to it. And it works really well in sort of brainstorming. It helps to, sort of cut through a lot of the negative talk that may pop up, and people are like, oh, that's something wrong with this, and this is the problem with that, and then you never get actually anything done. So yes and thinking is a great technique. This talk isn't about yes and thinking, so I won't go into more detail, but please take a look at it if that sounds intriguing to you. So this is encouraging yes and thinking because we're looking at solving multiple problems on here. Also, you'll notice when I started off, I didn't evaluate anybody's problem statement. I didn't evaluate any of the solutions that are posted up there. I accepted everything in, and then through the prioritization, we didn't say your idea sucks. We said, this is more important than that. And so, yes, this is important, and I think we need to solve this problem first. And we did that together and we discussed it. So we respected everybody's contributions, but we did put it in order so we have the context of how, what we want to do that. And so all of that stuff actually helps to really encourage intrinsic motivation. It gets people encouraged to come up with their own ideas for what these solutions are. It also makes use of that design thinking double diamond that I was talking about. So you remember these things. So we did problem first and just the problem. We did divergent thinking, thinking about a bunch of different things, come up with a bunch of different ideas, and then convergence. Let's get down to a narrowed list of what to do next, or some way of prioritizing these things again. Then we're going to branch out again on our problem solutions, and then we're going to pick just one solution. So we're going to prioritize and say, this is the next feature that we're going to build next. And so that's that double diamond approach. And if you've heard about this idea of step-based thinking, if we can do things rapidly, if we can come up with a bunch of ideas and be able to do them side by side, or at least evaluate them side by side, we're more likely to find the one that works best. And so that's what step-based thinking is about. And so all of these things are promoted if you're able to use the PEP Talk. And so it really comes down to this idea that, we implement solutions often without any regard for whether or not they actually solve our problems. So I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a backlog, worked with a team, and they've got this list of these prioritized solutions, and they're working on them, and asked what the problem was, what customer problem that we're solving. And when they go back and they look up, it's a customer problem that has already been solved, or is no longer a problem, or the person who raised the issue is gone and nobody else has the same problem. And we can't have it, we're missing that traceability back to the problem. So this helps to get past that stuff. And if you are only prioritizing your solutions, you're missing an opportunity to get ahead and start working faster. Because if you are only thinking about solving one problem at a time, if you're only thinking about doing one thing at a time when it comes to your solutions, you're missing out on the opportunity to have a solution that solves multiple problems. So that's the other thing, the big thing that this tackles. So it helps with alignment. It helps to get people out and to stop thinking about sort of the micromanaging of stuff. And it really helps to get people focused on solving multiple problems at a time, which is a lot more efficient. All right. We are ready for questions. I'll check the chat here.
Question from Jennifer. Do you also capture risk?
You also capture risk. I do. I wouldn't say that that is necessarily built into the PEP Talk itself. I would say that that is another thing. So once you get to your prioritizations and you're talking about the job size, that might be the best place to bring that in. So if you're looking at a particular solution and the problems it wants to solve, then you can start to do some risk assessments and say, which of these things, do have big unknowns that we don't know about that. That might compound the size, that might extend how much we might not have the resources, might not have the ability to solve it. So I think all of that goes into the evaluation process when you are picking and prioritizing your features. But that isn't necessarily the aim for the PEP Talk itself. But yeah, risk is definitely a factor.
Thank you, Pete. Any other questions? Going once, going twice.
And if actually while people are talking, I can also, I always loaded up some extra content to give people space and time to think. So a couple case studies in here. So I did this as what I call a rapid WizGIF for a PI planning. So what I did was I got all the managers together, all the product owners together, and I had them just make a list and reverse engineer everything they had and create these things. Now, the biggest challenge I had was we had a bunch of people who were like, the problem we need to solve is X technological problem. And you have to not prioritize business problems together with technology problems, was one of the big learnings that we had. And so, yes, it is a problem. Yes, the technical problem is there. That technical problem will be handled inside of job size. And it actually goes back to exactly what Jennifer was saying as far as risk, and it's built into the risk of this feature. And so we can factor that in through those things. But I would not recommend mixing technical problems with business problems. Make sure that first step is focused on just business problems itself. And then we ended up using Fibonacci weeks and planning poker. So we actually ran through and did, people posting up various different sizes and collected that so that we could use the people in the room to get a rough estimate of how big it was. And then we went back to the teams and we said, all right, we prioritized our solutions this way. We couldn't bring all of you in because of the nature of the session right there, but we really care about what you think and what the actual values are. So could you now go take these features, know that these are the problems that we're trying to solve, know that we think these features are going to solve these 2 problems or these 3 problems. And so that gives you an idea of what we're trying to accomplish with this. Can you go back and give us what you think are the accurate assessments? Should we increase the job size of this or even decrease the job size of this, and then get some real numbers? And so that worked out really, really well. And so they were able to use that in order to prioritize before their next PI planning.
I see a message from Ashish.
Aha.
It's this talk, any resource or this presentation we can get.
I can give you basically this in slide form. So you can take that back, so you'll be able to see the instructions that are there. You'll be able to see the steps that are involved, and including some of these details here, so that you can have that with you if you want to practice it.
Thanks, Pete. And we have recorded the session. We will upload it on our YouTube channel as well. So
fantastic.
Yep. Any other questions?
You're welcome. I'll throw in this other case study here. So kind of like we were doing here, is saying like, here is a management problem, or like, what are the biggest management problems that we want to solve? I did another version of this with a group of coaches. And so one of the things that we were talking about is what's most important for us. And we actually had this very good discussion between process and psychological safety. And we had a bunch of people who were saying that, when you are not feeling safe, that has to be the higher priority. And so we need to make sure that we're doing things to make people feel safe, to be able to participate. And then that's going to make process run more effectively and efficiently. But other people were saying, no, like, the process is what creates psychological safety itself. And so you need to tackle the process first. We need to figure out what our best practices are for our processes first. Then psychological safety will then, follow. And we had a debate going back and forth on this stuff. And while it wasn't the smoothest of debates, and while there were some high emotional things that did come up through that discussion, what it ended up doing in the long run is it made sure that everybody was on the same page. So it achieved the goal of alignment. And what we ended up doing is we actually rated, there was a majority of the people who wanted process first over psychological safety. I personally happen to be in the psychological safety camp, but what that told me was that if I could come up with a process that provided psychological safety and present the process to the team, I'm going to get more people on board than if I try to tackle psychological safety first with people who value process higher. So what's important is to understand where people are and be able to deal with people where they are and take that into account and be able to work with it, rather than finding the absolute order, and consensus is not a big deal. So that's why I say that when you're doing the prioritization, get to a point, just do a majority vote, put a time box on it, keep going, because what's more important is to understand what people are thinking so that you can then work off of that. You may not be able to convince people one way or another inside of